Hello, everyone. Thank you to everyone that stayed. I know some people were in here earlier and left, but I thought it would be nice to actually have a nice stream today to talk about more history stuff, since yesterday it seemed to go really well. Right. So because I love talking about history, obviously. um, that reminds me. How is everyone? Med check. Make sure you're up to date on your day's medication. Make sure to be taking them. Want to make sure that everyone's doing great and that we're all keeping safe and everything. For today, like I said on here, we're gonna talk about the Abbasids, or the Abbasids, Mexican history a little bit, particularly the Mexican Inquisition, and other stuff too. I'm gonna half lurk. I'm brain poisoned by sports, and my favorite team just traded. Okay, no worries. Also, if the music is too loud, let me know, because I can turn it a little bit down. Okay, I think that should be fine. Okay, so when we're talking about the Abbasids, right? Most people often might not know exactly. Oh, that's so good, October. I'm so glad you're looking for work from work. Thank you so much. Yeah, I want to get like a nicer set, but like this is what I have right now. Also remember, if you aren't subscribed, please consider subscribing, so we can have more learners. That's what I'm gonna, people that are interested in culture, history. Also, I'm thinking about like some point in this stream doing like a food tour, like watching one that's like in Mexico City and like explaining stuff. I was thinking about doing that because one, I always love talking about food, but two, because I was just in Mexico City, I've tried some of these places, so I don't know. Like I feel like if there was ever gonna be a Shakespeare con, right? It's gonna be in Mexico City because October and I have to go to all of the goth, like in Mexico City, being goth is like the best. Like over there, they actually have like a old Victorian mansion that they made into like a witch coffee shop. Like all of the drinks are like when they serve it to you, it has like fog and they look like potions and everything. But I've never seen a place like that in America. Like I've seen places like that in Europe somewhat, but like this place really, because it's supposedly a house that was housed witches at one point, supposedly a coven. So they actually went with that, right? They actually went with that to actually have that as a thing. So again, if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. That way you don't have to. Oh my gosh, yes. Oh, okay. I don't know if you can see right now, but I can show you one thing because it's like right in front of me. I got this little journal. Isn't it so cute? It's so cute. Oh my gosh, I love it. Yay. Right? It's so cute. Like, look at it. It's so cute. And it's like squishy too, and I love that. I was like, oh my gosh. And like the pages change, so like they're not all the same. Like they have like different characters, and then like the pages are different. Like some of them are lined, some of them are checkerboard, right? Like this one that has like cute little bees at the bottom. You can do that. It's like a really nice journal. So I got it while I was there, and so yeah. So there's that. Anyway, so I want to just kind of like introduce people very basically in a very basic way to what the Abbasid Caliphate and what it sort of was, what it sort of means historically speaking. So again, I'm using this phrase because this is typically the phrase that you might hear being used, say, on YouTube or other things. And we are going to watch a video, so don't worry about that. But I just want to like give you a mini lesson, right? So that way you already kind of know going in what they're talking about, right? So, so this here explains that the supposed, so this is the old name for it. They used to call it the Islamic Golden Age. Let me see if I can. This is what they used to call it, the Islamic Golden Age, right? But let's see. But please don't move. Ugh. The camera just decides to like. So, it's typically dated from the 8th to the 13th centuries. It is believed to have started during the reign of Harun al-Rashid, founded because he founded the House of Wisdom in the new capital of Baghdad. So Baghdad, when it was a purpose-built capital, right? Like they built it brand new. In fact, they built it in such. Oh, hi Buffy Geek! It's so good to see you. Hello, hello. Yes, yeah, all my mods, my friendly mods. So again, this is sometimes called the Islamic Golden Age, but it covers different dynasties too, right? Because like what happened in Spain is also considered part of it, but they were under the Umayyads, right? Because the last heir to the Umayyad throne, when the Abbasids, so essentially the Umayyads were the Islamic dynasty that preceded the Abbasids. And they were based in Damascus, in Syria. In fact, the biggest mosque in Damascus is called the Umayyad Mosque, right? Al-Masjid al-Umadiyya, right? So, the Abbasids were a big faction that were noted because they were very important because they came all of these people that we're talking about, most of them tended to come from Persian-speaking lands, and this was a huge cultural shift, which is why they decided to build the capital in Baghdad, since then it would no longer be deeply in an Arab space, right? But would be sort of in this crossroads between many cultures. But particularly like Shia, Islam, and Persian culture as well. It's also by the ancient Persian capital of Ctesiphon. If people know what I mean by that, I know that's like ancient Persia, but still. So when they first built Baghdad, they actually built it to be a circle, right? Where all the important stuff would be in the middle, and then everything, it would go around. So if you look at the plan of Baghdad even to this day, it still because it's been destroyed multiple times. And so the ending right here, when it says the 13th century, it's the end of this is again, this is not something that historians typically would use. Sometimes they might use it as like a shorthand for the entire time period, but it ended in the 13th century because that's when the Mongols took over Baghdad and destroyed the House of Wisdom, right? So that ended this entire period of cultural exchange, etc., that was happening across the world. So anyway, so as I said, it was founded by by Harun al-Rashid when he founded the House of Wisdom in the new capital, Baghdad. There are three important figures that I wanted to highlight, but of course they're not necessarily, you might not necessarily know them. So one of them is al-Zahrawi, who is known as the father of modern surgery, right? Like literally, like if it wasn't for his tractate on how to do surgery, like people still, at this point, people were still not actually using humans as their test subjects, right? And they didn't want to actually do like full-on surgery. because they instead, like in the Greek world, for example, one reason why Greeks preferred living in Alexandria was because in Egypt, there you could actually dissect corpses, right? I know that sounds kind of like grim, but the point was is that that's how they were able to learn about the body and its functions, as opposed to in Greece, they could only do it to, unfortunately, to pets, like, well, to dogs, to, animals that are as close to humans as possible, but that are not human, right? So Al-Zahwawi was important because he essentially founded modern surgery, like everything, like the idea of, and in fact, people will say that this is something that a European came up with later on, which technically, in a technical sense, in the modern sense, in the contemporary sense of like scrubbing up to go do surgery, I guess you could say that's true. The guy that invented the Rubik's Cube, actually, he was the one that like started the whole process of like of doctors washing up, right, to prepare for surgery. Before that, they wouldn't wash their hands, like in Europe. But Al-Zahrawi would wash his hands, like ritual washing, because again, he was dealing with human bodies, with people who were alive. So he viewed it as important for him to be in a cleansed state, I guess is one way to think of it. Then we have here Ibn Sina, oftentimes known as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine literally changed, like, I mean, it was still used until the 19th century. Like, he wrote a medical textbook during this time period. I believe he was in the 10th century, the 11th century. And his textbook on anatomy and everything, and medicine, was the standard textbook in Europe until the 19th century, and America too, until the 19th century. So it lasted quite a long time. This person is the one that I expect people to know the least, but it's Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi is very important, and if you know the Latin derivation of his name, then you might know why he's important, because the Latin for this. Remember, I've said that when you're switching languages, right, certain letters will go away. Like Latin doesn't have the ch sound, right? So it doesn't have al-Khwarizmi, right, so to speak. So that sound, that glottal K sound, instead becomes a G sound, right? And the Z becomes technically a Z is a TS sound, right? But it can also be it's a TS sound. So anyway, that being said, his Latin name is Algorithmi, or Algorithmi, because he's the person that essentially wrote the book on algorithms, and it's named after him. Like when people say, "Oh, the algorithm," that's literally his name. It's just the Latinized form of his name, of Al-Khwarizmi. Because in Latin, again, they don't have the ch sound, and the z sound didn't really also exist at the time. So it's Algorithmi, and that's where we get algorithms from. So those are three very important figures. There's also Al-Uqlidisi, who was very famous because he wrote on the Hindu art of reckoning. So essentially, up until this point, when you wanted to do mathematics, in Europe, you had to use Roman numerals. Okay? Up until this point. Like, you can technically do this, right? XVII times XI, right? Which is 17 times 11. But then you have to still write it out in Roman numerals. You have to do all of it in Roman numerals. So, Al-Uqlidisi um, famously, like, and these are just some of the numbers. You know, you have 1, 2, 3, right, and then Arbaha, and then but anyway, the point is more so that like these were started in India, but then they became Arabic numerals, right? That then were transformed into the ones we use to this day, right? So if it wasn't for Al-Uqlidisi introducing the Hindu art of reckoning, which is the title of his book, and reckoning used to mean mathematics, right? So we it would still be stuck with this system. So imagine trying to do all of these calculations, like how to find that lost death trap submarine thing, using Roman numerals. It wouldn't be very fun. It wouldn't be very fun. I'll put it like that. So anyway, so I'm going to turn off this and start playing.
My name is Siawish. History is usually a story of great men who were larger than life. These usually include monarchs.
Again, I like this channel overall because I'm so glad that there are now channels that completely decenter Europe as like the focal point of history. Like it's so difficult to do because one, like colonialism, like white people show up everywhere, right? Like, you know, it's like Europeans forced themselves to be included even where they're not from, right? So it's like, you know, if you want to write about, you know, history of Mexico, it's like you still have to talk about like colonization, right? You have to. It's very, and then a lot of some historians then start to focus on the figures of the viceroy and them as opposed to the average person on the street. And then you get histories that are like, oh, there was a lot of, you know, blah blah blah, there was a lot of, you know, political intrigue, but when you talk about the masses of people, it becomes very evident that there was a lot of dissent, right? So again, I'm not a fan of the idea of great man history because it's not real. Like, people like to focus on, oh, Napoleon, and it's really hard for people to get over that because it's like, ah, yes, Napoleon. But, you know, like, obviously Napoleon did X, Y, Z, but he didn't, right? Like, he was just there and he just had, you know, like, the fact that he was a good tactician doesn't, I'm not trying to take away from Napoleon's, wealth of knowledge when it came to tactics and warfare. Not that I'm necessarily, down for that. But if there is one thing that I would say, sorry, this fan is kind of weird, so I always have to like make sure it doesn't fall back. Anyway, hope it's not making too much sound. If it is, let me know. So anyway, so like great man history, I feel like it is. Come on, just stand still. Okay. Anyway, so again, it's very important to decenter Europe in these things, but I think it's too loud. It's important to decenter Europe in these things, but another thing too is to not fall into the trap of great man history, because that is a European way of looking at history, right? A colonialist, imperialist way of looking at it, because people don't look at one, like women, queer people, etc., right? And that's the problem if you focus on that. But anyway, I know that, we just started. I don't want to be pausing constantly as I usually do, but
Rebels, scholars, princes, etc. However, a vast majority of the people who lived in any given time and place experienced it from the perspective of a commoner. For most people in any given empire, it doesn't matter much who the monarch at the top is. Well,
exactly, like the people don't really, like, for example, like when, right now that we're entering this like political, season, like people are like, oh, we have like the distance between any government official in Washington D.C. and you is so far that it's really like that's why most people don't know who technically represents them, because there's like this it's an imposed distance, right? Like the whole point is that they are not like you, right? That's why they get to be a representative, right? And so that's kind of like where people sometimes lose. Sometimes they'll like get confused and think that this person represents me, or that the president is thinking about what I want. Again, it's like the whole idea of like a court, right? Like a palace and its court and its court culture. Just, I mean, all it did was just transfer to a bourgeois way of doing it, right? It didn't actually like go away in I mean, like it did go away in the aristocratic sense, right? But now it's just in the bourgeois way. So it's, more people are involved, but again, it's by class interest, not by actual direct interest with their constituents. So
Not always, but most of the time. Their daily lives were controlled by society and social norms. Much of it is influenced by the ruling class. So, today we're going to talk about what life and society in the Abbasid Caliphate.
by the way, this map here is the Abbasid Caliphate at its absolute height. This caliphate was known for one, having a high degree of, essentially, up until, I would say, yeah, up until Israel, the founding of the state of Israel, the best place to live if you were Jewish would have been the Arab world, or the Muslim world, if you want to call it that, right? As some people will call it, because because again, it was where like the Ottoman Emperor, later on, hundreds of years from after this, when Spain was expelling its Jewish people, Turkey sent ships and said, "We will take these people and allow them to live in our empire, and give them, the rights. I mean, rights as they existed back then, right? Like they're not the same as rights as we think of them now, because there was like different status, right? Different status that one could have in relation to whether you were Muslim or whether you were Christian or Jewish, etc. But this is why Jerusalem, in particular, has had a historic large Jewish population, and again, also why in what then would have been Baghdad and those areas too also had a huge Jewish population. Like al-Baghdadi is or Ben Baghdadi as well, is a very common Jewish name for Mizrahi Jews, right? So people who are, and Mizrach in Hebrew just means east, so it means like Eastern, right, Jews, but it really means like from Persia, from the Arab world, etc. And but again, like I'm sort of trying to get my point across here, is that the only civilization, if you want to call it like that, the only land mass that has been independent and all of that stuff is India is the only civilizational space, if we can call it like that. I don't like to use terms like Huntington's stuff about, but if people understand what I mean, right? Like of the different empires and everything that have existed in India, none of them have ever done any violence against the Jewish people. It's one of the only places in the whole world where that is the case. Like in Europe, the whole continent has been, anti-Semitic. But India was one of those places where Jewish people, and I think this is because India has always had such a huge diversity of beliefs and cultures and everything, so that it didn't matter so much. Whereas in other places, again, there was more orthodoxy, so to speak. But India is the one, like, if we can call it civilizational space, that has never gone against the Jewish people. Unfortunately, most Jewish people in India now are either expats, right, from America or the UK, who are there for for business reasons, or for other things. But there are communities that are like, again, one thing that's very important to also remember is that Judaism in its older stages, like before modernity, did have a period where it did proselytize, right? And that's why it competed with Christianity actually in Europe. But regardless, the point being that like the people that are Jewish in India look like everyone else in India, right? Like same thing with Mizrahi Jews, right? Like they look like where they're from, right? So to speak, right? It's in the same way how Ashkenazi Jews look like where they're from, and why I look like where my family's from, right? Mexico. So.
Or like around its peak from 750 CE to around 950 CE. This video is brought to you by, well, you guys. Thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel and making these videos possible. Al Muqaddimah is funded only by Patreon, and as you can see, the videos take...
I know I don't have a lot of viewers right now, and that's fine. I understand. It's kind of the middle of the day. Isn't typically when, most people are on anyway. But if people would like to become a Patreon patron or help me in some way, there's my link tree. There you can find ways to help me directly. Like if you want to send me a tip, like let's say, let's send Shakespeare $10, right? That's fine. Or if you would like to purchase, one of the books that I need, again, this Jews and Jewish Identity in Latin America, it's 33% funded. It's very close, to being completely funded. So, if you would like to contribute to that, that would also be great. And of course, if you don't want to have to deal with ads, this always, you can always subscribe and help this stream in that way.
Take a long time to research, edit, and produce, and it's only because of my patrons that I am able to put this kind of time into these videos and keep them free from any kind of paywall. So
yeah, like again, like the research that goes into when I'm trying to talk about history and everything. I mean, it's like I've mentioned before, like I could be writing or doing research or doing something, but I don't. Again, I am willing to do so if people are willing to be subscribers, be patrons, help me in some kind of way, so that then it's not a loss, right? Otherwise it would, and I'm sorry to bring this up. I mean, I know I hate talking about this stuff, but Twitch kind of forces us to. In any way, if you can help in any way, so then that way I can continue streaming, right? That anything helps, truly. So anyway, moving on.
if you want to pledge $1 or more to support the channel, you can head over to my Patreon. Link is in the description.
So yeah, see, my Patreon does not have that many things. It's like $3 and $5. It's just like, and I will, rather I should say, because I don't have any patrons right now, will post exclusive content there, that won't be available at all. Like it will never be on stream. It will never be on anything.
You can also become a member right here on YouTube. There's some cool stuff that comes with it. Back to the video. This video is in collaboration with the channel Eastern Roman History, who has made a video about the relations between the Abbasid Caliphate and their illustrious neighbor, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire to the north. Be sure to check out that video after this one. The link is in the description. Before we talk about the lives of Muslims, we need to talk about how they became Muslims. And yes, we'll mostly only be talking about Muslim men.
So yeah, this is another thing too, is that in a lot of accounts, in fact this even happens in the Christian Bible, like if people remember the miracles of the loaves and fishes, with Jesus, it only says that it only counts the men. It says like the miracle of the 3,000 or the 5,000 or whatever. I can't remember how much it is because it's like 2 times that it happens, right? Um, it specifically only mentions it only counts men. It doesn't count their wives, of which back then they could have had multiple, and their children, and anyone else, like if they had servants or other family there, right? It just talks about the men. Like Jesus gave the men bread and fish. So again, a lot of records literally just count like, oh well, if the dad is Jewish, then, and this is something that is also really important too, because some of this is also important for my own research, because in Europe, patrilineal heritage is what's most important, but in Judaism, it's matrilineal. So, like, people can still be like, according to Jewish law, if your mom is Jewish, right? Again, if you're Orthodox, and you have a child, it doesn't matter what the father is at all, right? That those children are 100% Jewish. They're not half Jewish. They're, according to Jewish law, right? So there's this kind of like disconnect, and this has led to like a lot of disputes. And there actually was essentially like a kidnapping case in Italy that happened in the 19th century, where they a family saved a young Jewish boy. And yeah, anyway, I won't get into that. If you want, we can get into that later. But
because our sources mostly only talk about Muslim men. The daily lives of Muslim women and non Muslim folks are largely absent from Islamic sources. My theory is that women didn't exist yet, they were only invented in the 18th century. So, Islam began in Arabia with mostly settled people who were merchants or farmers. Around the end of the Prophet's life, many tribes from all over the Arabian Peninsula joined his movement, leading to many nomadic Bedouins joining. These Bedouins made up a major portion of the military that expanded the Rashidun Caliphate into the Middle East after the death of the Prophet. When they broke and conquered large portions of the Byzantine and Sassanid empires.
So, one thing that's important to note right here is that Rashidun, right, like Al-Rashid, means the first, right? Rashidun. So, people might know of a holiday called Rosh Hashanah, right, which is the Jewish New Year, right? But Rosh means head, right? It's the head of the year. And in Italian, they also call New Year's, they don't call it Anno Nuovo. They call it Capodanno, right? Because of that, like, again, not all countries in Europe use that same system, but in Italy, because they do use head of the year, because capo means head, right? Like you put a cap on, right? So Capodanno means the same thing as Rosh Hashanah, right? Technically speaking. And so Rashidun means the first, like this was the first caliphate that ever existed as such. So
Muslims came to live within their former territory, alongside Persian Zoroastrians and Syrian and Egyptian Christians.
And remember that this was still a time when, and again, Egyptian Christians still make up a large portion of Egypt's population, right? Like oftentimes people kind of like forget that there is still the Coptic church as well, and there are other churches too, like the Roman Church, also the Coptic Church and the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria are two different churches, right? So the one that's the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria, that one is in communion with the Ecumenical Patriarch and is one of the Eastern Orthodox churches. The Coptic Church, which most people know, and they have a pope, they are not one of the Eastern Orthodox churches. They are an Eastern church, technically speaking, but they are aligned with the churches of Saint Stephen, which is in Persia, the Church of Armenia, and this is because of a theological difference, right? Monophysitism. So I'm not going to go too deep into that theology, but just so people know, it's like have I studied ancient Greece? Yes, I have. I've studied it in this both. Well, I've especially looked at like the economic context, like economic history, social history, cultural history, because um, I don't know. I've always been really interested. Uh, about Macedonians. I mean, like if you're talking about the contemporary country that's now called Northern Macedonia, then it's a like a again. I think that the best way to so the best way to I guess I would answer this question is Benedict Anderson and other scholars have written about imagined communities. Now, this isn't to say that that they're deluding themselves and thinking that they are blah blah blah. No, rather it's that um, over time, right? Like the ethnogenesis of a people starts to when it starts to develop, it eventually starts to take on characteristics of where it is, right? So that is to say, why do they identify with Alexander the Great, right? Like, because if you actually go to Skopje, right, um, you will see that they've kind of made everything look in a kind of like neoclassical style. Hello, Maggie. So good to see you. Um, and so, but the peoples that lived in Macedonia, like that in that region of the Balkan Peninsula, because Greece is technically part of the Balkan Peninsula, but anyway, that were called the Macedonians, that were like say like Alexander the Great and Philip II, etc. Them, um, it would they obviously were seen as Greeks, but what's very interesting about them is that during the Macedonian conquest, right, if we can call it like that, some historians do like to call it that. I'm just using it for shorthand, okay? Is that what actually ended up happening was that instead of Alexander through his conquests, well, I mean, he really just conquered Egypt and Persia. They make it seem like, I mean, I'm not trying to diminish what he did, but it's kind of like he just took over like the two neighbors that were nearby. Like they make it seem like, but I mean, he did start like the Bactrian, stuff like that too. But that's a whole different story. In fact, once I actually, again, I'm really nerdy, right? And this is why sometimes I feel like, like I know the stream is never gonna be big. I'm never gonna have like 1,000 subscribers or patrons on Patreon or whatever. Like I'm not gonna really like I know because history is history. But at one point, I actually tried to take the language of that existed when the the Greeks the Greek kingdoms that were like essentially just around the area of what is now Afghanistan, etc., and the Scythians, or the Indo-Scythians, technically, when they came together and they started to they started to speak a language that, again, because all of the languages of that area are all from the same language family, from the Indo-European language family. They were able to speak a form of Greek that took in all of these elements and essentially created a whole new language, to some extent, right? And so I tried to like find documents in that and try to almost like create, like, with the little information we have, like almost like a grammar of what it was, right? Like, but again, that's just because, yeah, he went to the Hydaspes, right? Which is, like he went there, but he never crossed into what is Iron Maiden, but he never but his armies never went into like the into Rajasthan or anything like that. Like they never crossed the Indus, right? They did cross the Hydaspes. In fact, there is a book called Travels to Bahara by famous British, so he was one of those British explorers, right, that actually liked the cultures that he was around. So like he lived in Kabul, right, in Kabul. But he actually writes of when he has to go from Delhi, I believe it's Delhi, no, from Lahore, all the way to cut. I mean, he goes all the way to oh, what's that? Oh my gosh! Thank you so much, Kyra Safira. Oh, well, I mean, like I said, the Macedonians, by definition, are Macedonian. I mean, they are what they are. Like, you don't need, they are, like I said, this is why I mentioned Benedict Anderson, and you can even reach Shlomo Sand. Like, in his book, even, I mean, some people obviously see it as controversial, but, like, in the idea of in the invention of the Jewish people, it's like, other people outside create, also form part of an ethnogenesis, but it's through one's own community, right? Like if they identify with if you identify with Macedonia, if that's the land that you live in, and that's also the cultural artifacts that you build upon your own, then yeah. See, I don't believe in race science. I would never use race science. I don't like that's just dumb. Because that's not how anything works. Like that's not how people work. You know what I mean? I mean exactly. I mean like well, I mean technically not even the Athenians were Greek, right? Like they saw themselves as distinct to the Laconians, right? Otherwise known as the Spartans, right? They saw themselves different from the Corinthians, right? It's only later on when, again, they're part of the Roman Empire that then you're a massive Dongian. But, it's like, for example, I mean, in fact, Powerful Finger, I actually can sort of perhaps give you a good example. Most of we had a right-wing PM who built all the crazy statues. I mean, like, again, I think that's also, well, we have massive poverty. It's funny because I remember one time someone told me that I should contact the prime minister at the time. I don't know who it was. Because he was essentially saying, like, we need professors, right, that teach, history, culture, whatever, that are willing to teach at our university. Because apparently, like, the main university in Skopje, it doesn't get a lot of international people that are willing to work in North Macedonia, and they were like, we will give you citizenship. Oh, this was like 2017, something like that. It was a long time ago. It was like 2017 to maybe was it 2017? I don't know. But they were saying like, oh, it's really easy to get North Macedonian citizenship, and you can, live there, and I'm like, I have no problem with the idea of, oh, you had a colored revolution. Oh yeah, so see, I don't even know. Yeah, exactly. So I have no idea. It was either Zaev or Gruevsky. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember. But Zaev, for some reason, Zaev is ringing a bell for some reason. But again, that could just be because that's also I know people that are Jewish that are named Zaev too. But anyway, so the point being that that they were like the faculty. We don't have any because for example, like America loves to hire when it comes to history departments. They love hiring British people and Germans. Like I'm not even joking. Like they will pass up the best scholars that are from America, so that they can hire a British person or a German person, right? And they're always the white British, white German, right? Like that's what they want to have in their departments here. They don't want a Mexican like me to, for example. And of course they will deny it and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, you can tell when, whenever they are hiring, they keep getting people that are oh, this person's from Oxford. Oh, this person's from, Tübingen or from Göttingen or whatever. You know what I mean? So anyway, point being that all countries have this, desire to have scholars from other countries work there, right? To give prestige, I guess, but also to make sure that that they can support scholars that can make it easier for the university to participate in international things, because I participate in international stuff all the time. Um, but oh yeah, yeah. Oh no, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's what I'm saying. If you haven't read Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, that's the book you should read, because that's literally like, I know people who are Greek that try to pretend like back in the day, right? I have a friend who's Greek, and it's like he is left wing in almost everything, right? Like he's, whatever, progressive in every way, but when it comes to the idea of Greekness, of a Hellenic identity, he's like, yeah, the Greeks were a nation back then, and it's like, no, like we know this because. And they also didn't identify with other peoples in Europe, right? Because even the idea of Europe didn't really exist at that time. So, it's like this like weird hog opinion that he has, and I'm just like, I don't know what to do, honestly. Um, but, because again, he's from Greece. Like, he's from Greece. So again, like those biases that you're mentioning are very apparent, right? Like he wants Greece to have been a nation 3,500 years ago, so then that way, you know, whatever, but again, the idea that ancient peoples had the idea of a nation just doesn't make sense because it just didn't exist. Um, like even people living in the city of Rome were seen as being a different people group than people that lived outside of Latium, right? Like only they were Latins. Not everybody, like people could be Roman citizens, but you were still Syrian, you were still Greek, you were still Sicilian, or whatever, right? Carthaginian, whatever it might be, right? Or not even Carthaginian, but it's not like everybody became Roman, so to speak, right? Like as if they were from Latium or a Latin, right? Same thing with the Greeks. Like they had no idea of that wasn't a concept. In fact, if they did have a concept like that, then it would have been reflected in other people's description of them, right? No one describes all of the people who all the people groups, the ancient people groups who are in classical antiquity, as being necessarily the same. In fact, this is so much the case that you can tell it in other languages, because what a Greek is, or who they see as Greek, is actually a regional thing, right? Like if you go to in Arabic, al Yunus, right? That means the Greek, right? And then in Hebrew it's Ioanim, right? Ionian, right? That's a Greek, the Ionians, but that's what is now the western coast of Turkey, right? By Smyrna and all that stuff. The Balkan is a pretty interesting place because historically we were never united, nor we had a whole liberal nation until the 1900s. Maybe that's why we had all the wars later than most countries. The only positive side is we become small nations with unique languages. We didn't end up like France culture. Yeah. Well, see, and what the interesting thing about what you just said about France is that we know that in 1880, 4/5, so 80% of the French population did not know French, right? So even when they were already a bourgeois state, right after the revolution, this is like 100 years, right, about to turn into the 20th century, it's when it's at the end of the older form of capitalism and the beginning of imperialism that it requires a bureaucratic state apparatus, right, to do right worldwide imperialism, and so that needed standardization and rationalization, and so that's why like for the Balkans, because the Balkans were the colonized imperialized spaces, that's why what you're saying about it never being united and stuff like that, it's why a lot of things were well, it does mean, however, that things have been imposed upon the Balkans, right? But it's always been from other powers, right, that have taken over so much land, right? Like, oh, they speak Turkish, right? But people still speak Bosnian. People still speak, or Serbo-Croat Bosnian, right? Because they're very related. I mean, they essentially are one language, just, you know, Macedonian, North Macedonian, right? Like people would still speak in those languages, right? Because the Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic empire. It wasn't it wasn't a settler colonial state as such, right? As we think of it now. So again, so in a way, like that's also why people say that places that resisted imperialism or that were, like for example, like in Russia, like in the Soviet Union, they say that's why like distinct cultural differences between Tajiks and Kyrgyz and all these different people groups remain because essentially, But again, I don't want to be like, oh, the Soviet Union protected that. I mean, they definitely said that they would. Yeah, like the imperialism and capitalism requires standardization or rationalization because that's how it functions best, right? That's how it's able to function in the way that imperialism requires, and so that's why the Prussians, yeah, Tajiks are Iranian, or rather they're an Iranic people. Persian is the Greek term for describing, comes from the Greek term from describing their encounter with Iranian peoples for the first time, which was in the province of Parsis, right? And so they called them Persoi, right? And that later became Persian, right? Persiani in Latin, but like the name for themselves is Iran, right? Like same thing with like Tajik, like they are also an Iranic, it's the reason why, like, because I know Dari, right, which is the Farsi, so to speak, or the Persian, right, the Iranian language that is spoken in Iran, but it's a different dialect. It's a different, and it's even seen as a different language because of so much difference. But the one that's spoken in Afghanistan, right, and then Tajikistan is they also speak and then South Ossetia or Ossetia, which is currently under Russian administration, they also are an Iranic speaking people, and they're the only ones that are technically in Europe, but they're in the Caucasus. But anyway, and this is again, I could go off on so many tangents, but yes, like because I mean, ethno-nationalism as such is never a good thing, I would say, just as a general rule. But one of the ways that, we can look at examples of more blatant, right, ethno states, right, where they actually had. And by the way, I want to make sure that people understand this. It was during the conflict that happened in the Balkans in the 90s. It was Serbian generals who used the term ethnic cleansing as a euphemism for genocide. So like when people say, "Oh, it's not genocide, it's ethnic cleansing," like it was meant to be a euphemism for genocide. So like they're literally falling for the trick of the genociders, right? That's why, like, for example, someone who that's why, like, someone who once said that there is no genocide happening against blah blah blah, right, might say, XYZ thing, but if they say, for example, oh, yes, the process of Aryanization in Germany, that was ethnic cleansing, not genocide. It's like, that is genocide. Like, that's literally what it is. But anyway, like, again, Powerful Finger, if you ever want to talk about this, more in depth, I would be glad to, because sometimes I'll hang out, like, if I'm researching and reading. Like, if I'm reading, I usually like to just be in the VC in my own Discord, and I'll just be sitting there. Like usually, I'm sitting there and no one shows up. So, but I would be glad to talk more in depth.
Initially, these largely Arab Muslims lived in separate garrison cities like Kufa, Basra, Fustat, and Kairouan in Iraq, Egypt, and Tunisia, respectively. However, Islam began to disperse into the conquered peoples. And here we'll talk about one of only two certainties in life: taxes. So, in the first century of Islam, the conquest was bringing Muslims a lot of captured booty. The result.
Well, I mean, besides talking about booty, which I'm always down to do as well. No, but this is the problem with. So I'm just gonna note this really quickly. When Europeans talk about, I'm not saying that Al Muqaddimah is doing this. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is when Westerners try to talk about other peoples that have had empires, they always note um, I guess their violence more, right? Their conquest more. Like they act like the Byzantine Empire didn't sack and loot and all of that stuff either, right? They act like, oh, they were all saints. Like no, that's not true, right? So again, that's just something to keep in mind because, I mean, I know Al Muqaddimah is trying to be uh, keep to like a more digestible thing, which is good. I'm not against that. But just keep that in mind as students, as learners. Sorry. Again, I want to call my community learners because like we're all learning together, right? That's why, like, again, if you would like to help and if you would like to, not have to see ads, you can always become a subscriber. I mean, it helps me and it lets me know that I should keep streaming because, again, if I can't make it work over the summer on streaming, then it's gonna go quick. I'll just put it like that.
So a lot of loot. Taxes were imposed on the dhimmi population. Dhimmi means protected person and was used to refer to non-Muslims living in the caliphate's borders. They paid higher taxes and were hence given some protections. Their taxes depended on how they were conquered. If they were conquered in a long drawn out siege, they were taxed higher, but if they had capitulated easily without resistance, the taxes were lower. These taxes were used to pay the soldiers and their descendants. To avoid high taxation, people started to convert to Islam. Non-Arabs were converting to Islam in large numbers, and it led to a decrease in revenue for the caliphate. So, non-Arab Muslims were given the status of second-class citizens who had to become clients or mawali of an Arab tribe and still had to pay higher taxes than Arab Muslims.
So this distinction between Arab Muslims and non-Arab Muslims became a huge issue because, again, as much as it is true that Islam in general has been much more egalitarian in many respects, it did cause a division between the Umayyads and the Rashidun, and well, particularly the Rashidun, because they came from the area around Mecca and Medina, right? So they were people that kept going to make the caliphate, right? The Rashidun Caliphate. But I know after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and a Muslim person would say now, after saying his name, peace be upon him. But point being that this meant that they wanted to create a caste system, but it wasn't effective enough because first they wanted to do it based on religion. Now this is actually very relatable to what the Spanish did later on when it came to Jews and Muslims themselves. Like when they finally defeated Granada, but even before that, technically, they already tried to do essentially what is being described here as well.
This led to a lot of resentment, as you'd expect. However, bringing these former Greek and Persian speakers into the fold of Islam had a huge impact on the Islamic world as well as Islam.
Again, we have to remember that the area that stretches from Lebanon even to Turkey, all that, that was all Greek speaking. Like that's the and even in Egypt there was a lot of Greek speakers, right? You know, even like everywhere in the east, what was then the Eastern Roman Empire, they spoke Greek, right? And then and everything that is the Persian Empire, also going into northern India, they spoke Persian. At least when it comes to India, it's usually a courtly language, but still. Point being that like this belief that Greeks were like never converted to Islam, or that they were never, that's not true, because Al Yunus is a very common surname in certain parts of Syria. And in fact, like when I was in Syria, there's a lot of people named Al Yunus because they are technically speaking ethnically Greek, at least historically speaking. I won't say that, oh, it's, I don't believe in this, like, oh, you know, like you somehow you're magically connected to people from 800 years ago, right? I think that that's just, you know, that's kind of like race science, right? It's kind of like it's stories people tell themselves. Oh goodness, what happened? Oh, Gremlo, thank you so much for following. So glad to see that. Wow, was not expecting that. Thank you. So I'm glad to see that that people are enjoying the stream. So anyway, you know, because there isn't that type, that isn't really real, right? So I instead recommend that you know, people, like for example, like this is something that I've called indigenous epistemologies, right? Don't deny people's indigenous epistemologies just because of Western science, right? Like, because race science is not something we should take as though it's true, right? In fact, we should be very skeptical about it because it's designed to undergird and uphold white supremacy, right? That's the thing, right? Like, and you can see this when, like, it doesn't matter if the DNA test says that Nick Fuentes is 1% indigenous, right? Because again, he like, there are white Latinx people, right? Nick Fuentes is one of them. And like, even in, for example, since his family is from Mexico, it's like there are white supremacist Mexicans, right? Because the white Mexicans can be white supremacists. So it's not a good idea to focus on, right? That's why it's better instead to focus on your family's understanding of itself, right? Because that actually has more weight, if you think about it, than anything any test can give you. In fact, someone recently sent in, you know, those 23andMe, right? You know how you have to send saliva? They did it for their cat, and it gave them like, oh, like this cat is like a, you know, not Scandinavian, and like, again, like a lot of these things, it's just putting like things together and saying, oh well, you must be this because these traits mostly show up here. Again, like there are people that aren't counted as Jewish, or that are counted as Jewish rather, I should say, if they have like Southern Polish, Belarusian, like West Ukrainian, like this area called the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were forced to live under the Russian Empire. Like, if you have DNA, you know, quote unquote, from there, it's gonna say that you're Jewish, right? Even if your family was Polish Catholic. But again, because it's again, just race science in general, just avoid it. Never use it, and especially do not give your DNA away to a private company. Like, no.
Islam itself. It was probably around the year 1000 CE or so that many places in the Middle East came to have a majority of Muslims. It was these non-Arab...
So think about that. So remember that from the beginning in 600, what would you say, 600, all the way until the 10th century, the majority of people in the Rashidun Caliphate were not Muslim. Then it changes and shifts over, and then this also changes the cultural center of gravity as well.
Muslims who supported the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 CE. Specifically, it was Persians who still carried memories of their pre-Islamic past and their glorious empires as they do to this day. A little too much sometimes, if you ask me.
This is true. There is a hog that I would put on a video of his, but like the problem is that he's that guy that Polly I had Polly play a quick clip that he's like, oh, in the future there will be statues to certain people that ruled Germany from the 30s to the 40s, right, and stuff like that, and he got fired for that, and he also started the alt-right corporation with Richard Spencer. So I don't want to platform him, right? That's the problem that I have. But he is part of an organization that they were the Farvahar. The Farvahar is the symbol of Zoroastrianism, but is used by Iranian nationalists who want to overthrow. Hello, Tempu, how are you? That want to overthrow the Islamic. Estoy muy bien, ¿y tú? And replace it with another monarchy. So
as a result, a lot of Abbasid society was a mix of Arabian and Persian cultures. Among the many subtle indicators of this mixture, there were also some not so subtle ones, like the celebration of pre-Islamic.
Since they're talking about subscribers, I'm going to talk about. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Make sure to hit the little bell icon. That way, it tells you when I'm streaming. Make sure to go to our Discord. Make sure to check out all of my links if you would like to support me in any way. Again, anything helps, whether it's helping purchase a book for my research or becoming a subscriber. Trust me, that helps so much.
Annual traditions such as the Nowruz among the Persians and the Shaman Nassim among the Egyptians. Both of these are celebrations of the arrival of spring. Whenever someone tried to restrict the Nowruz, people got really angry. Iranians love Nowruz almost as much as telling people how Islam was forced upon them and destroyed their great civilization and whatever and blah blah blah. Speaking of
exactly, like that's something that this guy, I'm not even gonna say his name, but he particularly says either that like he believes in that what's his name? I mentioned him earlier. That guy that believes in like the Clash of Civilizations hypothesis. I think Huntington is his surname. Like he believes in that, which is not true. Because it essentially says that if you don't live in Western civilization, then you can never be part of Western civilization, right? Like it's like that's how it's been used ever since. Did they have zakat back then? Yeah, of course they did, because that was something fundamental. I mean, that's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, zakat. So
of Islam, it was one of the biggest parts.
Which in Judaism, it's the same thing too. It's just called tzedakah. So you can see the how they're, because they're both Semitic languages, how they both have that same origin.
Everyday life. Islamic traditions pretty much dictated many of the events of the day.
Pre-Palestine.
Muslims are supposed to pray 5 times a day, and those times are marked with a call to prayer. The business day was set to the rhythm of these 5 times. Businesses opened around dawn shortly after the first prayer and closed around the 4th prayer in the evening before sunset. The most important annual events were the 2 Eids, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. Along with them, during Abbasid times, people began to celebrate the day of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims who can afford to do so are required to perform pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lives.
So there's this guy who, like, he's one of those, like, reverts that, like, is, like, really, like, he's, like, really, yeah, the Kaaba, yeah. He's a revert, and he is super like transphobic, queerphobic, etc. Like he's one of those like, oh, I became Muslim because I wanted to be, and he's actually from the Balkans, if I remember correctly. I think he might be think he actually might be North Macedonian, actually. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Point being that he's like his idea of Islam, this orientalized idea of Islam being like anti, unprogressive, etc., anti-progressive or whatever, is why he always is talking about it. And one of the things that to me it sounds like a grift, but I don't know. Like it's not really for me to comment except for the level of my knowledge, right? Like from what I understand, if you can go to Makkah, you have to go, right? And if you can't, that's fine, right? But he started a service where you pay him and they send someone to go do Hajj, right? And they do it for you. And I've never heard of that being done like in that way. Like it kind of sounds a little weird to me, because he's like, yeah, you pay us, and then we like send you like a video and a certificate, and like they send one of their guys there to go to Makkah. So I don't know. It's just like it doesn't. Something about it just sticks out to me as like this doesn't seem real.
The pilgrimage season was a huge event for the Abbasid Caliphate. Roads and routes were examined and maintained to make sure that they were good enough for the pilgrims. Since
one thing that people often don't think about when they're talking about history is this is why like cultural, social, economic historians, right? Because a lot of cultural historians are also social historians, and I also work with economic history, etc. Blah blah blah. Point being that, because I'm very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, all that stuff. Like I can't stay in just one narrow field. I always have to work in more than one. Again, one thing that people forget is how important roads are. Like one of the reasons why, or one of the aspects why, French industrialization took longer than in Britain was because of the fact that the road maintenance that was supposed to be done by the crown usually was never done, right? Because it was like the bureaucracy of like after the revolution, like when the monarchy was restored, and industrialization began. The reason why it became so like fixed in northern France is because that was the only place that had roads that could connect it to ports and other things, whereas like southern France didn't have as good roads because different reasons, bureaucratic reasons, also nepotistic reasons, etc., cronyistic reasons. So that was one of the things that was a somewhat. It's not like, oh, if they would have had better roads, they would have been more the industrial powerhouse bigger than Britain. But it's to say that they, through not taking care of their roads, also meant that people who would have otherwise had access to towns and stuff, they couldn't have that access. So there wasn't as much communication and stuff like that. And in fact, this really affected, like when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, the Russian roads were notoriously bad. And so this meant that the where Napoleon could go once he had crossed the Niemen River was very limited. Like, and that's kind of one of the reasons why, like, when he was retreating, he had to take the Smolensk road because the other roads were like very bad, poorly kept. So it's like it was a benefit because of the invasion, but then like after the war, like once Napoleon was gone, like because Russia still didn't develop them as well, that's also what left to a huge distance from the aristocracy in St. Petersburg and around, and the recently freed serfs after Alexander II. So
people came to Mecca from all over the Islamic world, it was a great center for trade. People often brought over goods that would be sold to cover some of the expenses of the pilgrimage. We'll talk about trade more later on. Islamic society was supposed to be built on the principles of law and justice. So even early on, courts were established with judges called qadis to resolve disputes among the public. They were supposed to consult the Quran and the traditions of Prophet Muhammad.
So this is kind of like what a rabbi is to some extent. Like technically speaking, as a rabbi, I can write rulings down based off my research and stuff. People can ask me, "Oh, is this kosher?" Blah blah blah. I mean, I'm not a practicing rabbi, so to speak, right? But in a very general sense, right? Like people can ask me questions about Judaism, its Jewish history, etc. But like what like these qadis, right, and like the dayanim or the rabbonim in Judaism, it's like that's kind of what they do. It's more like they are there to make sure that, like, oh, according to halacha, according to Jewish law, you know, yes, you transgressed, you did this, and if you go to a beis din, which means a house of judgment, or a house of justice, then there you will have the dayanim, like the actual rabbis who are judges, and you can actually sign, like you can actually go, instead of going to an American state court, if it's a certain type of legal proceeding, you instead could have it happen in Jewish court. And one reason why sometimes people prefer this is because the sentencing is very different. Like if something occurs when it comes to theft, right, or something like that, or like I'll just use that in a very general sense. The person would the defendant would then owe the plaintiff, right, the cost of the thing plus half of that. So 1.5 times what they stole, right, or what they ruined, or what they, you know, broke or whatever. And then that would be the end of the mediation, right? Like it would be to make sure that the assessed value, blah blah blah, make sure that everything was going right, and that they knew that it was wrong to do the blah blah blah. So because if you do it in a civil court in the United States, you know, if you do it before a jury, or like the amount could be much more, right? Some people prefer to do this only within the Jewish community. Like they will only consult dayanim, right, and rabbis and stuff. So
Of the Hadith and the Sunnah. However, since there were many cases that didn't have direct examples in the traditions of the Prophet, jurists had to come up with ways to resolve these as the Prophet would have. This resulted in the establishment of a huge law canon called the Sharia, which today has many branches. Within cities, different branches of the Sharia were usually implemented by the Qadis, while in the countryside, local traditions reigned supreme. Speaking of the law, Islam bans alcohol consumption outright, but despite that, alcohol consumption seems to be quite common in Abbasid society, not only among non-Muslims but also among Muslims. We know that ruling elites drank quite a bit of it. Shops and markets that sold alcohol, though, seem to have been the exclusive domain of non-Muslims. Only non-Muslims sold alcohol, mostly wine made from grapes or dates, to both Muslims and non-Muslims. It seems that there were laws against Muslims consuming alcohol as well, but they were hardly ever enforced except during political rivalries. In short, you could drink alcohol in private, but not in public. The Abbasid Caliphate had a remarkable amount of social mobility. You could be born in the worst of conditions and still rise up to very close to the top. If you were born at the bottom, there were a couple of ways that you could rise up. The most common ones were being a scholar, a poet, or a secretary. It is within these posts that we see the most diversity. Military ranks could also help, but depending on the time period, the highest echelons of the military were dominated by one ethnic group or another. The importance of poetry and poets cannot be exaggerated in Abbasid society. Both the Arab and Persian societies have a lot of veneration for poetry, so much so that a couplet is called a bath in Arabic and Farsi, literally meaning house. So anyone who had any amount of money wanted to patronize a poet to compose poetry glorifying him and his family. From caliphs to provincial governors and even bureaucrats had poets on their payroll. It was also a form of popular entertainment. Good poets were highly sought after. Not only poets, but poetesses were also hired. Women of the high society had their own social gatherings where female poets would recite their poetry. Female singers were also sought after. People had their daughters trained as singers so they would catch the ear of a member of the elites. Somewhat surprisingly, one of the most famous schools for that was in Medina, the holy city of Islam. That's because it was a holy place and had a nicer climate than Mecca, so rich people retired there and needed entertainment. That's where female singers came in. The third Abbasid Caliph, Al Mahdi, had a wife or concubine who had previously been a singer. Her daughter, Ulayya bint al Mahdi, was herself an accomplished poetess along with being a princess. Other than that, a sort of hidden bureaucracy was made up of black eunuchs, who, since they were eunuchs, enjoyed access to the harem, which no men outside the royal family had. As a result, they played an integral role in court intrigue. Black eunuchs seem to have been so powerful that Caliph al-Mu'tadid punished a group of people for calling one of his eunuchs a slave, even though they were technically slaves. The lowest rank of society was made up of beggars, thieves, homeless folks, and, of course, prostitutes. Prostitution was a fairly desegregated industry compared to other industries in the Abbasid Caliphate. We know that both male and female prostitution was quite common. Together, this rank of society was known as the Banu Sasan, literally meaning the children of Sasan. A later, maybe apocryphal explanation for this term is that the Banu Sasan were literally members of the old Persian elites of the Sassanid Empire before the rise of Islam. They had since fallen out of wealth and into poverty. However, that explanation is not necessarily accurate. Many members of older Persian elites were accepted into Islamic establishment, so I really can't say where the term comes from. Some of the people at the margins of society ended up becoming storytellers, where they'd attract people by telling stories in city squares. It seems that it was quite common for these storytellers to discuss stories of the companions of the Prophet, primarily the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, and the fourth Caliph, Ali. This, as you might expect, could rile up Shia-Sunni rivalry and lead to situations of civil unrest. Public order was maintained through an organized police force called the Shurtas, with a head known as Sahib al-Shurta. This was not necessarily a separate department as it is today. Instead, it often fell under the military's oversight. Another oversight office was that of the Muhtasib. The office of the Muhtasib is an extension of the Islamic idea of every Muslim, quote, commanding what is good and forbidding what is not. It can be imagined as a sort of morality police, but with an office like that, we would expect it to regulate the purchase and consumption of alcohol by Muslims, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So in practice, the Muhtasib was mostly responsible for keeping order in public areas, such as markets and mosques. They were in charge of keeping the market clear so people could go in and out freely. Oftentimes, the merchants would put their wares well outside their storefronts and take over the entire street. I mention this because it's still a problem in the Middle East as well as in my own home country. In fact, the marketplace in most of the Islamic world doesn't look that different from the markets in the Abbasid Caliphate. Other than the lack of government oversight, not much has changed. The office of the Muhtasib was also responsible for making sure that transactions were taking place in a legitimate manner. For example, by verifying coinage material and weights. The 12th century author Al-Shazari, who wrote quite a bit after the decline of the Abbasids, mentions that the Muhtasib was even responsible for making sure the scales used by the merchants are clean and without any corruption. Also to ensure that the items are being priced fairly. Interestingly, according to Al-Shazari, one of the responsibilities of the Muhtasib was to make the physicians who operated public clinics take the Hippocratic Oath, as well as making sure they were not preparing poisons for anyone or telling women about medicine that helps with abortion. So I guess there was a bit of moral policing there. The Islamic world constituted a huge market from India to Spain. This was a rather open market, not unlike the European Economic Area today. To ensure trade was possible between residents of all these various empires, there were many institutions that were kept up by the Caliph. One such instrument of trade was an agent known as the Serafi, whose job was to ensure that coins coming from outside the Caliphate were legitimate and to establish an exchange rate for them. Additionally, you could carry a bag of coins and have your own city's recognized officials stamp on it.
So this office here is very very important, and existed in some form as well in Europe, but later on, particularly in the 13th century and onward, was that like this is why a lot of like the early things of what we might think of as banks today started off as with goldsmiths, but money changers, right? And I know that term is fraught with a lot of one anti-Semitism and two, you know, but this was necessary, right? Because Spain, right? Like its coins were always like its dollars, right? The silver dollars, right? That they had, or the pieces of 8 that usually people know, right? They were made out of silver. So you had to have a certain weight of silver before you could get a gold dinar, right? So, which was the typical which was the typical currency of the caliphate. So again, this office is really important because it was to make sure that one, like there was a crime against coin clipping, right, which was to like try to get some of the weight off, like clip a little bit of it and melt it down, like, you know, you would accumulate enough silver or gold to then, you know, be able to have more money. Like that was a crime, also in Europe. And another thing too is, remember, like the exchange rates and everything were things to also ensure that because just like Jewish people have ribit, in Islam you have riba, which means, which is again, it means that you cannot give loans at interest, right? So again, these people were very important because all of the exchange that's happening, and again, they could be of any group of people within the caliphate. The main thing is that they were trusted people, and so that's why a lot of them became, you know, very important later on with investing in trade stuff later on.
With its value, and you can transact with it in any other city. Among other tools of trade were sak and suftaja. Sak is almost exactly like a check. In fact, it's possible that the modern term check actually comes from sak.
Yeah.
You could give someone a sak in exchange for goods. Okay, that sounds dirty. It's not that kind
Oh
of
my
stuff.
gosh.
Anyhow, it was a piece of paper that guaranteed that you could withdraw money from a bank. A suftaja was a similar thing, but it applied over long distances. Speaking of trade over long distances, before the rise of Islam, wheeled transport seems to have disappeared from the Middle East. People traveled and transported goods on the back of a donkey, a mule, or a camel. During Islamic times,
Well, one thing I want to note is like people focus on like oh, they didn't use wheeled things, but it's like in some places it's unnecessary for even now, like in many parts of Africa and West Africa, um, it's literally boat travel is the preferred form of travel because then you actually can actually move things around, whereas because of the torrential rains, right, that can happen, means that you can actually you know, like the road, and this does happen a lot all over the world, because again, like not everywhere, like even in America you see this where like parts of, like this is why like they built a train in California, in Southern California. It was supposed to go from LA to San Diego, right? But because they built it right along like these cliffs, there was a mudslide and now there's no more train, right? Miss Anita Bump was talking about this earlier, or yesterday I should say. So again, like because mudslides happen there all the time, they should have put the track somewhere else, but because they wanted to have an unrestricted ocean view, they instead chose to have it right there. So again, like car travel is actually really, like car travel in general is just bad, right? Like any excuse that I hear for why individual owners of cars should be driving around long distances just doesn't make sense. Just logistically and everything else. I mean, whatever. But the point being that, like, people like to focus on the wheel because they think that that the history and the world functions like a tech tree, right? Like, unless you have the wheel, then you're civilized or something. And that's something that, like, white nationalists like Nick Fuentes literally said at one point, where he's like, well, Africa didn't have the wheel. What's like, the Egyptians had the wheel at one point, for example. But what is Egypt known for? The River Nile. So boats were what was most important, not like that's how you could actually transport things across the whole country, as opposed to wheeled, stuff. Whereas again, in parts of like Kazakhstan, etc., like where like in the two areas in the Botai culture, which is in China-Russian border, Mongolia area, and the Yamana culture that both, because two cultures that domesticated the horse at around the same time, and so their adoption of wheeled wagons, right, or wheeled chariots or whatever it might have been, it was not as though like it stuck with them only, right? Like that's just to dispel all of the dumb Nazi BS that you'll hear, that like, oh, the Scythians or blah blah blah, or that the Aryans blah, that they led an invasion on chariots against the Dravidian. That didn't happen, right? We know this because I've gone over this before, that it wasn't an invasion. It was a migration over hundreds of years, and within a century or so, other cultures that could use wheeled transport used it. But like in Greece, for example, it's so mountainous. There's no, like, would they say Greece is, not, since they base a lot of their things off like the Spartans, like it makes more sense in Greece to travel by boat, right? Like there's no reason why you would, like, so anyway. Okay, thank you so much, October. I'll see you soon.
This remained the norm. Since these animals didn't need paved roads to move about, an extensive road network like the one developed by the Romans never materialized in the Islamic world till modern times. That's not to say that the Caliph didn't develop any long-distance trade infrastructure. Bridges, inns, and rest houses, or funduk as they were called, were paid great attention to make sure that people were able to travel with the least amount of inconvenience.
And these places are huge. Like, you can visit them. When I was in Syria, I visited one, and like it's huge, and they're made out of stone because the whole point is that when the traders get there, right? It's like a I mean, kind of like a, think of it like a rest stop, right? It's meant to be a place where when a place where you can beat the heat, right? You can go inside. There's food. There are drinks, etc., etc., etc. So it's like essentially more like rest stops with hotels, right? Because people would stay there. They actually had already invented, because the Persians already had invented essentially an air conditioning system of a kind anyway, that collected air, like as wind came across it. But they essentially, these places were like as close to being modernly air conditioned as possible. So I think that's always worth recognizing.
Speaking of infrastructure, the Abbasid Caliphate, even early on, seems to have put a focus on public hospitals called Bimaristan. The first of these could have been built by Harun al-Rashid in the 800s.
Also, another thing about hospitals is that a lot of because of what Tempu mentioned earlier about zakat, is that people could do zakat in multiple ways. Like, zakat did not mean like a tithe that you give every week, right? It could be you sponsor the building of Barmistan, right? So a lot of very wealthy people would instead do zakat that would essentially be for a long time. It would count as if it were for like their entire life, essentially, if they would build a hospital, right? Because the benefit would be for, ages and ages, as opposed to, just a one-time thing. So
But there's some evidence to suggest that when the city of Baghdad was built in 762, there was consideration for hospitals there as well. By the year 1000, there were around 5 public hospitals in Baghdad. Other major cities had them as well.
another thing to remember too is that because these things were sponsored, a lot of times the people didn't pay for what the like because they were public hospitals, right? And these hospitals also were multicultural, right? Because again, there has always historically been more toleration of Christians and Jews and other Zoroastrians, etc., in the Islamic world than in what is called, in Europe, right, or what is sometimes called the Western world. And so this meant that, people could have Jewish doctors, Jewish surgeons, or Christian, and all of that stuff. And there was much more cultural interchange than had ever existed, that anything that existed in Christian Europe. Because in Spain, in Islamic Spain under the Umayyads, they also sort of did this too. And so, again, it wasn't perfect, right? It wasn't, perfect peace or whatever people might think. Like, obviously there were issues, but it was much better than literally living anywhere else in Europe. So
These public hospitals were considered charitable and teaching institutions and were funded by rich patrons such as princes and emirs. Muslim scholars of the time expanded on Greek medical practices and established a huge canon of works on treating different parts of the body. Along with this, folk treatment.
I actually want to sort of say something about this. When the Caliphate, I think it was the Umayyads, but I could be wrong. Could have been. When they were beaten, they were about to take Constantinople. Like, they had started a war and had made huge into Anatolium. They said, "Can we give you something in exchange so that way we can end the war?" And they say, "We will take a copy or like the book, the Almagest by Ptolemy, I believe. Ptolemy's Almagest? Is it a Ptolemy? I don't know. For some, it's either Ptolemy or Galen. I don't know why I'm confusing the two because they're very different. But anyway, they said, we will take that instead. Like, we will stop the war if you give us, your books, right? And so that's a very different thing that sometimes is never really talked about in discussions about the Islamic Caliphate. Like, they were willing to stop warring against the Byzantine Empire if they gave them knowledge, essentially.
Treatments were used as well. There were also public baths in major cities, which were used by both men and women. Some baths were used by men and women on alternate days, while some were reserved for men or women.
By the way, this was common in the Eastern Empire, in the Eastern Roman Empire as well. And this was something that was actually held against by the people in the Western Empire, and also in Islamic Spain, because they said they bathed too much. Like, there were people, again, anyone could go to these bathhouses, and wash, etc., be cleaned, etc. And so they started to, like, even in Roman times, they were making fun of the fact that Elagabalus, who is sometimes called sometimes seen as like a trans. Hello, Woody Red. How are you? So good to see you. I'm so glad to see that you're here. But yeah, it's so good to see you. Yeah, hello, welcome. Welcome into the stream. I'm so glad to see you. I hope that we can have a nice stream today. What isn't it? There we go. Sorry, it's kind of acting kind of weird. Anyway, OBS is always acting kind of weird. So they used to make fun of people from the East because they would bathe, and in fact, this was something that was during the Inquisition was held against Jewish people and also Muslim people who converted to Christianity, was that they had to take upon the Christian custom of not bathing so much, right? Like they said, it's weird if you take too many baths. It's weird if you're always washing your hands. So they would literally police people's actions when it came to things like that. So just so people know, it's like when people talk about like, oh, the Inquisition, blah blah blah, like the reason why the joke is not really funny to me is because like it was so total, right? Like literally someone could go to the office of the Inquisition, right, to one of the ecclesiastical courts, and say, oh, I think this because they light candles on Friday evenings. And now you have, and the way how it works, because it's literally the inquisitorial system, is that you are guilty until proven innocent, right? So again, like one of the ways to do that was you had to completely change how you behaved, right? Like that, because the idea of being a Christian was a holistic one. Now people think as though like, oh, Christianity is something separate, right, from all identity. Like it's something you can add on, right? Like a separate DLC, right? But no, like during this time, the idea of being a Spaniard, or being, whatever it might be, was interlinked with being Christian, right? So that's why, in order to become acceptable in Spanish society, once the Christians had taken over all of the Iberian Peninsula, was you had to literally stop taking baths. You literally had to stop washing your hands. You literally had to allow yourself to get sick and stuff like that.
One of the duties of the muhtasib was to ensure that nothing nasty was going on in the baths. During Abbasid Caliphate al-Muqtadi's reign, apparently it was quite common for people to enter and exit a bathhouse naked, which the muhtasib was instructed to stop people from.
Also, another thing is, in the same way how bathhouses work now, bathhouses have always worked that way even back then, right? Like this belief that there was never any like what we would consider homosexual relationships, or even just like same sex sex, I guess, is not true. Like again, because it's just like bathhouses have always functioned. It has always had that kind of a function, because of the fact that, one, if it's all male, right, and there just has always been that there. I also didn't like that Al-Muqaddimah did use the word prostitution. Like I think it's wrong to call it that, because it makes it sound like like it's blaming sex workers for stuff, right? And it's like, no, you don't blame sex workers, Anyway.
Doing. I really hope they didn't have to tackle them. Islamic theology puts a lot of emphasis on learning to read and write, and so in the Abbasid Caliphate there was a lot of emphasis on education. Not only Islamic education, but also other subjects like the sciences and arts.
Also, there's this book called The Sayings of the Prophet, right? That is, or rather, there's also a book. Pardon me, I'm confusing this with the Hadith. But the Prophet Muhammad said, "Go and find knowledge whithersoever you may find it." So this is why during this time there was the translation movement, at which Baghdad had about 50, maybe 60 translators. And I kid you not, like the Caliph at the time, I believe the Caliph Al-Mansur, would literally pay you the weight of a book in gold, like whatever the book's weight was, he would give you that amount, that weight in gold, in exchange for a book he didn't have in his library. Like that's how, and there was a translation movement that was started by the Caliph, because again, they said it even with Al Rashid, to make Arabic the standard language of the empire, right? This is why so many countries now speak Arabic, because they chose one standard language for all of the everything having to deal with all of the positions and all of the official stuff and all education. It meant that because there is this emphasis on reading and writing, everybody had to learn Arabic. This is why, again, while there are some languages that have survived, like Berber or Amazigh, for example, this is why, like, the African Romance language that we know existed essentially went away because it got replaced by Arabic. Because, again, they no longer had contact, or they no longer were part of the Western Roman world once the Western Roman Empire fell apart, right? So, and after the Vandals also took over Tunis, right, like that also made the language also fall into decline. So, anyway.
There was and continues to be rigorous debate about educating girls, but from what we can tell, a remarkable number of girls were educated in the Abbasid Caliphate. The institution was called a madrasa, which had rooms for teaching as well as apartments.
Again, like the idea of learning and being at a school is very different from how it is now, right? Because like the way it's institutionalized now in America, and I'm using America as the example, is that it found its basis in the Prussian education system, but then America sort of changed it from that, especially now that America just like cannibalized all education in the entire country just to make it all privatized. But like the idea of becoming a scholar was not something about going to a university and getting a blah blah blah. It wasn't that in that way, right? It's not that there weren't institutes of higher learning, but that learning was very much like you went to study under blah 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 person, right? And then you could become an expert in many different things. But one of those things of your main expertise could be navigation, right? Astronomy. How to use an astrolabe, etc., right? So then there's that, or there were people that focused on mathematics, right? It wasn't like it is now, where it's kind of like, well, one the government doesn't care about education. In fact, if there was a way to uneducate us, it would do so, right? Like it would to try to sell us back education, right? So again, that's kind of a huge difference that we need to think of, that we need to consider. Because remember, in Europe, in this time, learning is only reserved for, even with kings, there were even kings that lived their entire lives illiterate, literally did not know how to read and write, because it was almost exclusively the domain of the clergy. So while in the Abbasid Caliphate, the need for people to learn how to read and write and in Arabic and everything was far expansive, and rose literacy levels to a standard never really attained in medieval Europe. One of the reasons why medieval Europe never attained it was because literally they put a stop on it, saying only the monks, only the scribes, only, so.
For teachers and students. Many of these madrasas even gave diplomas called ijaza, which basically meant that the teacher deemed his student knowledgeable enough to teach a particular subject.
Exactly.
Pre-Islamic Arabian
that's the point, is that it's more you study under that person, and then that becomes a way of vouching for you, right? Like, oh, he's become a master in astronomy, so now he can teach astronomy too, right? And you were still expected to contribute to scholarly discussion, right? So in many ways, it was a more in many ways, it was much more egalitarian by a huge degree, as opposed to the European system, which was reserved for very few. And even once universities did begin to pop up in Italy, etc., like even Oxford, like they usually started off almost exclusively as, kind of like how Harvard in the United States started off as a divinity school, right? It was for the training of priests, and then later was for the training of the upper classes, of the aristocracy, I should say, not to educate people in general, right? This is why the distinction between Ivies and everything else, like, it still exists. Like, you would think that if the people that are saying, oh, America's gone to the dogs, quote unquote, were right, that the Ivy League would not literally be the forcing house of the bourgeois government and its bureaucracy. Because literally, like, if you go to Harvard, you're going to end up working for the government in some way, or with some part of the apparatus of the state, right? So
Society wasn't as patriarchal as later Islamic society was. There were matriarchal tribes existing around Arabia as well. However, its most
another thing too is, remember, Judaism is matrilineal, but it's technically patriarchal. But there are some historians that do find it interesting that, again, Jewish people lived in what is now Saudi Arabia, right? In fact, one of the people that support the Prophet Muhammad first when he's in Medina are the Jews of the city. So again, like, you have Temanim, which means Yemenite Jews. Like, there is also some evidence to say that because of that some of the tribes that were I say, again, tribes to describe small bands of people, not to describe an entire nation. There were some people groups, right, that some of which included tribes, nomadic ones, that were matriarchal, and that some of those had become Jewish. And eventually, when there was a Jewish kingdom in Yemen, that there was an element of matriarchy embedded within that, right? Like essentially, like the king's mother could intercede for someone else, stuff like that.
the case that when nomads settle down in cities, women tend to lose some status. In Arab society, kin was everything, and so a child's parentage had to be solid and without doubt. Various things exist within Islam as well to ensure that.
So see, when they say parentage, this is a big difference. This is where the point that I brought up about matrilinearity is different about Jewishness, where Islam and Christianity focus on patrilineal, right? Which is why Christianity has had multiple crises of chastity. In fact, like, everything that's happening right now with, like, the whole red pill stuff, I kid you not, was happening during Shakespeare's time, right? Like, back in the late 16th and early 17th century. Literally, there was a crisis of chastity, a crisis of legitimacy of people's children, right? That because, again, it was a way, there was a fear that this was it was an affront to the patriarchal society that they lived in, right? And to then be cuckolded, right, and other things, right, was such a ridicule because, again, it meant that then you couldn't be certain about the parentage of your children, and your children, because they were seen as property, were your only way to extend capital at that time. So, so this is why you start seeing a lot of this, like, panic that we're having now, and that's why some people, including myself to some extent, I don't think it's as, but, like, Shakespeare lived in early stage capitalism, right? We live in late stage capitalism. And because of changes in the world, right, that were happening around the 1580s, 1590s, is what started to cause this issue in England, but it started in France. Because it was on the nature of women, la querelle des femmes, literally the quarrel of women. There's so many books about this, but anyway, about what a woman's place in society should be. And again, back then, they did not believe that men were the sexual half, quote unquote, of the species, right? They thought they said women. They said women were the ones, right? Women are the sexual ones. They're the ones that are always horny. Men aren't, right? So like exactly what we have now, just switch it over, and that's what you would have. But also the crisis of chastity, right? Like, oh, men are reasonable, right? But women are passionate. This is like, again, goes back to these terminology that they used back then. So women, if they cheat on their husband, right? Like this is again, so this is why, for example, the idea of matrilineal descent in Judaism was such a difficult thing for Christianity in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, which is the Renaissance, that troubled a lot of countries at the time, right? It troubled England in 1290, hence they expelled the Jewish people. 1492, same thing, and the Inquisition afterwards, because there's this like, well, this like everything becomes about lineage. So this is when you begin to have these huge genealogical compendia being built of people trying to figure out, like at one point the Inquisition in Spain actually said, in order to prove your purity of blood, that's what it was called, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, to say that you don't have any Jewish ancestry, you have to get records of all of your ancestors going back to time immemorial to prove your purity. Think about that for a second. Most people can't even go past their own grandparents, even today with all the modern technology. Imagine being told you have to go back to time immemorial, right? So like essentially as far back as when people could, there were any records kept of wherever you lived. So again, this was a huge problem with the Inquisition, right? Which is why I don't find Inquisition jokes funny, right? Because they had such horrible standards in order to make it so that they could take things from you, right? And so again, anyway, this is a tangent, but yeah, I'll be right back.
For example, after divorce, a woman must wait 3 months before she can remarry to make sure she's not pregnant. This led to gender segregation as well, where women tend to stay in rather private parts of the house where non-related men aren't allowed. Not to mention, women have to wear some kind of veil or covering when out in public. However, the nature of this covering is debated and changed with time and place, and I'm not going to go into that. These rules were, in practice, only for wealthy households. In fact, the veil was considered a symbol of wealth and elite status. Peasant women tended to work next to men to make a living and enjoyed considerable freedom as compared to richer women. Although what freedoms truly exist in poverty aren't really my place to define. Along with up to 5 wives, men of means tended to have female slaves and or concubines. Like slaves in other parts of the world, they didn't have much of a status, but if a child was born to a concubine, then her status improved quite a bit. Many caliphs were born to concubines instead of wives, from the Abbasids to the Ottomans. In Islam, children tend to have the legal status of their father, and so the legal status of the mother is of no consequence. Slave women were also used for domestic work and going out to run errands for the household. There's some poetry even where a free woman is lamenting about how her slaves have more freedom of movement than she does. Aristocratic women had perhaps the most restriction on movement. One of Harun al-Rashid's sisters was so beloved by her father, Caliph al-Mahdi, that he allowed her to go out in public, but she had to dress like a man to do so. But in general, rich women could just throw parties and have female guests over. They were also patrons of poets, scholars, and other charitable institutions. While we talked about life in the cities and somewhat in the countryside, we haven't discussed one vital region of the Abbasid Caliphate, the frontiers. To tell you what life was like for the Abbasid citizens living on the northern border, here's Daniel from Eastern Roman history.
But what was the experience of life like on the frontier for the Arabs during the Abbasid Caliphate and their stubborn neighbor, the Eastern Roman Empire? Hello and welcome. I am Eastern Roman History, and this is my part of our collaboration with Al-Muqaddamah. The Abbasid Caliphate and the Eastern Roman Empire shared a border with each other for several centuries. Understandably, life on the borderlands proved quite different for families living there than those living in Baghdad or Constantinople. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the Taurus Mountains provided a natural barrier between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Caliphate. Towns in northern Syria, Armenia, Cilicia, and Anatolia were frequently raided by armies from both empires. To mitigate damage caused by punitive raids and major offensives alike, both empires developed well-organized and sophisticated military systems. Byzantine provinces called Thebes were subdivided into termini, and, under the Emperor Theophilus, small commands called Clausuri were established to guard mountain passes. Local forces subsisted on their farms and were paid annually in gold coinage called numismata by the government in Constantinople. Thematic defences were centred around fortresses and fortified towns. One such example...
Thank you everyone for hanging out with me. I have to go do something though. So we're going to raid out, see Miss Anita Bump. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. Tell Anita hi. Hello, Erica. Good to see you.